more than excited to have you here for this evening and for our trialogue. Very happy to see you all and that everything worked out well with the technique. I would like to mention that I will do a kind of introduction into our theme and would like to introduce you to the public. And then Heinrich Bedford-Strohm will go forward and
right.
initiative. Okay.
What was the last word? TIV?
The initiative.
Initiative. Okay. Okay. All right. I will just start a question. I will just say a few words and then I will address you, the two of you, and we will. It's not going to be a problem. We have so many things that we want to tell us that time won't be enough, and we will just try to get the maximum out of it.
You're totally.
I'm very curious, so you have to expect many questions from me.
Yeah.
Good.
Ihr seid live.
Yes, we are already live.
Yes.
Okay, good. Everyone can hear it.
Fangt an, begrüßt alle.
Okay.
Wir haben schon über 47 Teilnehmer.
Good.
So will you give me a sign, Wolfgang? Or?
Ja, fang an. Ihr seid schon live. Das war das Zeichen.
Okay, so I will talk in German. Ich werde also in Deutsch sprechen. Wir, die Moderatoren, das sind Elga Zachau und ich, Christel Weber. Und alle anderen werden in Englisch sprechen. Heinrich Bedford-Strohm, John Dorhauer und Traci Blackmon. Und sie werden alle übersetzt. Ich hoffe, die Sie zuschauen, Sie haben alle den Button gefunden, mit dem Sie Ihre Sprache finden, in die übersetzt werden soll. Das finden Sie normalerweise unter dem Globus da unten auf der Leiste. Wenn Sie da drauf drücken, können Sie Englisch oder Deutsch anklicken. Ja, und jetzt beginne ich. Herzlich willkommen auf dem UCC Online Forum. Das ist für uns eine große Sache, das jährliche UCC Forum online zu machen. In diesem Jahr feiern wir das 30-jährige Bestehen der Kirchengemeinschaft zwischen der UCC und der Evangelischen Kirche von Westfalen. Wie diese internationale Partnerschaft das Leben vieler Menschen geprägt hat und noch immer prägt und sogar verändert, das haben wir gestern Abend auf dem Abend der Kirchengemeinschaft gehört. Und wenn Sie jetzt ein Glas neben sich haben, oder vielleicht auch eine Tasse mit Kaffee, können Sie gerne mit mir auf die Kirchengemeinschaft anstoßen, denn das ist ein großer Schatz für uns. Unser diesjähriges Forum, also ein Toast auf die Kirchengemeinschaft. Unser diesjähriges Forum haben wir Kirche geht an die Öffentlichkeit genannt und wir haben hinzugesetzt, Kirche bleibt öffentlich. Das setzen wir der Verzagtheit von Christinnen und Christen entgegen, die sagen, ach, wir werden ja doch immer weniger und wir werden immer unbedeutender und die sich deswegen hinter sicheren, dicken Mauern zurückziehen. Aber Kirche und Welt sind nicht zu trennen, davon sind wir überzeugt. Und das hat uns auch die Kirchengemeinschaft gelehrt. Wir sind Kirche in der Welt. Und das Evangelium ist eines, das Menschen befreit, oder es ist kein Evangelium. Es setzt die Welt miteinander an den Tisch. Der gedeckte, einladende Tisch ist das dominierende Bild des Evangeliums. Gemeinsam essen, trinken, Freude und Leid teilen, Leben und Ressourcen teilen. So soll es sein. Und so hat es uns auch die Kirchengemeinschaft gelehrt. United in Christ's love, a just world for all. So fasst es die UCC in ihrem Mission Statement zusammen. Ich habe jetzt also die Freude und die Ehre, Sie in den kommenden Trialog einzuführen und Ihnen diese drei großartigen Menschen vorzustellen, die wir miteinander ins Gespräch bringen wollen. Der erste in der Runde, den ich erwähnen möchte, das ist John Dorhauer. Den sehen Sie mit dieser geballten schwarzen Faust hinter sich, Black Lives Matter. Vor einigen Wochen trat John Dorhauer wieder einmal online in Erscheinung. Das sind sie ja in den USA schon viel länger und viel deutlicher gewohnt als wir hier in Deutschland. Da hatte sich gerade President Number 45 vom Weißen Haus zur National Cathedral in Washington mit Tränengas auf friedliche Demonstrierende den Weg freigeschossen, um eine Bibel hochzuhalten. Und John Dorhauer beginnt seine Online-Antwort mit "You didn't pray." Du hast nicht gebetet. Er spricht den Präsidenten persönlich an. Er wirft ihm vor, dass er, der gerade erst die Kirchen inständig gebeten hatte, trotz Covid-19 wieder zum Gottesdienst zu kommen, er hat sie ja für essentiell erklärt für sein Land, dass er nun nicht einmal selbst in die Kirche geht, um zu beten. Er missbrauche die Bibel für seine Zwecke. Und John Dorhauer hat nicht zum ersten Mal so eine provozierende Äußerung von sich gegeben. Er fällt gelegentlich durch pointierte Äußerungen auf, hat zum Beispiel gesagt, Donald Trump ist nicht gewählt worden, obwohl er ein Rassist ist, sondern Donald Trump ist gewählt worden, weil er ein Rassist ist. Und das konnten wir auch in unseren deutschen Zeitungen lesen. John Dorhauer sagt das in seiner Funktion als General Minister und Präsident der United Church of Christ in den USA. Er ist also der leitende Pfarrer, so etwas wie der Heinrich Bedford-Strohm für uns. John Dorhauer hat diese Position seit 2015 inne. Zuvor war er Conference Minister, also so etwas wie Präses oder Bischof in verschiedenen Landeskirchen. Er erwarb im berühmten Union Theological Seminary sein Doctor of Ministry mit einer Arbeit über White Privilege und ihre Auswirkungen auf die Kirche. In seiner ersten Amtszeit hat er sich immer wieder dazu geäußert und unter anderem mit Traci Blackmon ein Curriculum für die Gemeinden erstellt, das sich Weiße Privilegien, Lass uns darüber reden, nennt. Eine Anleitung zu einem Dialog, der verändert, zu einem Transformational Dialogue. Dieses Curriculum hat unsere Übersetzerin, auch von heute Abend, kürzlich auf Kosten der Evangelischen Kirche von Westfalen ins Deutsche übersetzt. Wir wollen das hier auch in Deutschland benutzen. Und für alle, die interessiert daran sind, an diesem White Privilege Curriculum, es ist in der Arbeitsstelle Möwe erhältlich und auch im Ökumene-Referat bei uns. Darüber hinaus hat John Dorhauer ebenso wie die Evangelische Kirche von Westfalen kürzlich einen Zukunftsprozess für die UCC angestoßen. Er hat einmal erzählt, dass er dazu nicht wie üblich die Amtsträger und Honoratioren der UCC eingeladen hat, sondern junge Menschen. Und er wollte mit ihnen über die Zukunft der UCC ins Gespräch kommen. Was ist nötig? Woran müssen wir arbeiten? 5 Prioritäten sind dabei herausgekommen. In den USA geht das ja immer ein bisschen kürzer. Ne? Bei uns waren es jetzt gerade 11 Leitthesen. Da in den USA waren es jetzt 5 Prioritäten. Wir brauchen, sagt die UCC, inklusive Exzellenz, eine technologische Infrastruktur, von der alle Weisen, Kirche zu sein, profitieren, ein Curriculum und ein Training der Mitglieder im Blick auf die Mission der Kirche. Und die Mission der Kirche wird A Just World for All beschrieben, eine gerechte Welt für alle. Eine Anpassung der Organisationsstrukturen an Zweck, Vision und Mission der Kirche. Also Strukturen und Inhalte von Kirche sollen zusammenpassen. Das finde ich besonders super. Und Plattformen, um Innovationen in der Kirche zu ermutigen und zu pflegen. John, I'm so excited to have you here. Thank you that you joined us. Die zweite.
Thank you for allowing me to come. It is an honor to speak to all of you.
Yeah, it is an honor to us, John. Die zweite im Bunde, Traci Blackmon. Sie ist eben von Chad Abbott schon ausführlich vorgestellt worden, zu Beginn ihres Vortrages oder vielleicht kann ich auch sagen, zu Beginn ihrer Predigt. Also, das ist ja immer diese besondere Mischung bei Ihnen, bei Traci Blackmon aus politischer Aktualität und tiefer Lebensweisheit, aus ordentlicher Erdung und tief gegründeter Spiritualität, die Traci Blackmon zu einer Inspiration macht. Nicht umsonst ist sie eine der bekanntesten Predigerinnen in den USA. Und ich darf vielleicht auch sagen, in Traci Blackmon hört man auch das großartige Erbe des African American Preaching. Da wird das hörbar und erlebbar, da wird Predigen zu einem Erlebnis. Da können wir noch ganz viel lernen. Traci Blackmon ist leitende Pastorin in der UCC für die Fragen der Gerechtigkeit und, man höre und staune, für den Dienst der lokalen Gemeinden. Mir ist Traci Blackmon das erste Mal aufgefallen, als sie am 30. Juni 2018 vor 30.000 Menschen gesprochen hat. Die hatten sich in Washington versammelt, um gegen die Immigrationspolitik des Präsidenten zu demonstrieren. Dagegen, dass er die Kinder der Immigranten von den Eltern getrennt hatte. Sie hat an diesem Morgen, finde ich, eine historische Lektion erteilt. Sie hat gesagt, ich bin gekommen, um uns daran zu erinnern, dass wir hier schon mal waren. Ich weiß, das fühlt sich brandneu an, aber das ist es nicht. Wir waren hier schon einmal. Wofür wir hier Zeugen werden, an der Grenze mit schwarzen und braunen Familien, ist nicht, was Amerika geworden ist durch die Trump-Regierung. Das ist das Amerika, das es immer gewesen ist. Das ist bis heute die Antwort der Nation, wann immer sein falscher Gott des Weißseins in Gefahr ist. Welchen Gott beten wir eigentlich an? Traci Blackmon stellt uns diese bohrende Frage. Welcome, Traci Blackmon. We are so honored and happy and excited to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Und der dritte im Bunde, Heinrich Bedford-Strohm. Reinhard Bingender hat in der FAZ 2014 ihn den öffentlichen Theologen genannt. Und in der Tat ist er zurzeit bestimmt der bekannteste amtierende Theologe in Deutschland. Er ist seit 2011 Landesbischof der Evangelischen Kirche in Bayern und seit 2014 Ratsvorsitzender der Evangelischen Kirche in Deutschland. Er war Assistent bei Wolfgang Huber und hat sich mit einer Arbeit Vorrang für die Armen auf dem Weg zu einer theologischen Theorie der Gesellschaft promoviert.
Der Gerechtigkeit.
Der Gerechtigkeit, das war jetzt mein Fehler. Und sich später mit der Arbeit Gemeinschaft aus kommunikativer Freiheit, sozialer Zusammenhalt in der modernen Gesellschaft habilitiert. 2004 hat er einen Ruf als Professor für systematische Theologie und Gegenwartsfragen an der Universität Bamberg angenommen. Und an diesem Lehrstuhl ist dann auch das Institut für öffentliche Theologie entstanden, das für uns in diesem Forum so wichtig ist. Wir haben dieses Forum ja genannt, Kirche, Church goes public, Church remains public.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer Forschungsstelle für öffentliche Theologie heißt sie genau. Der Name Dietrich Bonhoeffer ist Programm.
Ja, super. Ja, von solchen Instituten für öffentliche Theologie gibt es weltweit mittlerweile einige und zu denen haben Sie auch guten Kontakt. Auf diese Weise sind Sie auch Honorarprofessor in Stellenbosch in Südafrika geworden. Also kurz und gut, der Mann ist ein Global Player und ein Ökumeniker par excellence. Und unser Forumsthema ist sein Thema und deshalb sind Sie, lieber Herr Bedford-Strohm, auch von Beginn an unsere erste Wahl gewesen. Und das sehr, dass Sie hierher gekommen sind. Sie haben das Thema umfangreich reflektiert und Sie leben öffentliche Theologie. So, jetzt kommen Sie gerade aus der EKD-Ratssitzung. Das ist ziemlich nett, dass Sie sich diesem Stress hier aussetzen und zu uns kommen. Vielleicht haben Sie dort über die 11 Leitsätze gesprochen. Darin steht, Kirche soll sich weniger oder besser gezielter in der Öffentlichkeit zu Wort melden. Nur vom Evangelium her, vielleicht können wir darüber auch noch sprechen. Vielleicht haben Sie dort auch über die Sea-Watch 4 gesprochen, das Schiff, das auf Anstoß der EKD oder einer Petition auf dem Kirchentag und mit Hilfe eines großen Bündnisses jetzt auf dem Mittelmeer unterwegs ist, um Geflüchtete zu retten. Das haben Sie ganz ausdrücklich zu Ihrem Ding gemacht. Und ich habe eben in der Arbeitsgruppe mit einer Frau, die bei United for Rescue Gründungsmitglied ist, Katharina Stamm, gehört, wie sehr Sie auch persönlich dahinter stehen und Ihr persönliches Engagement dieses Projekt möglich gemacht hat. Ich möchte Ihnen jedenfalls persönlich schon mal herzlich dafür danken. Kurz, der Mann ist genau richtig hier. Jetzt den Trialog eröffnen. Ich möchte Ihnen dabei nicht weiter im Wege stehen erstmal, aber zusammen mit Elga Zachau an einem bestimmten Punkt dann dafür sorgen, dass die Fragen und Kommentare der anderen an ihren Bildschirmen zum Zug kommen. Und an die richte ich mich jetzt nochmal. Bitte schauen Sie schon mal da unten auf Ihren Button. Bei den deutschen Teilnehmenden steht da F und A für Fragen und Antworten. Ich glaube, bei den Amerikanern steht einfach Q&A, also Questions and Answers. Da drücken Sie bitte drauf und da stellen Sie dann bitte Ihre Fragen im Chat und Elga und ich, wir werden die dann einbringen. Wir möchten, dass dieser Trialog am Ende etwas breiter wird. So, und nun nach langer Vorrede meinen herzlichen Dank noch einmal an Sie drei. Blessings to your conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Christel. My part is to open the conversation. Maybe I should also add to your introduction my American side, because I'm actually the only person in my family without a migration background, as they say. And in this case, it's even an US American background, because all my 3 sons, I married my wife in 1985 near Boston in Andover, Massachusetts. That's actually where my Bedford comes from. My name used to be Heinrich Strohm, and so you have an American part in my name from 1985. It actually led to the fact I have to sign pretty many documents, and my hand is much more in work since I expanded my name at that time. I didn't know yet that I would have to sign so many things. Anyway, of course, my heart and the heart of my family is in many ways, and actually half of my family is physically in the United States. And let me say, it's a nightmare that we also go through, that we have gone through in the last years. And I just hope so much that things will change. And so people like you, you are a big hope for me. And John, I heard you speak at the EKD Synod, I told you that when I briefly talked to you, it was almost a huge comfort to have this American church leader tell us about the situation and be so clear and speak to my heart. So that's why I'm also very happy to see you again here. And Traci, what I heard from your sermon really leads me to say, when can I hear you? I hope it will be soon. I studied in Berkeley in 1985, lived in Oakland in a black neighborhood as a student, and in my street there was an African American, a black Lutheran congregation, and that is where we worshipped. And the preacher, Richard Wallace, he shaped my own understanding of what preaching really should be so much. So when people ask me as a church leader here in Germany, where are your roots? In terms of preaching, I always say it's the preaching of my preacher in the 42nd Street in Oakland. I can't do it like him, but he's an inspiration for me until now. So that's why, again, I hope to hear you sometime. Where am I now? I want to start with that before I address you. I'm not anymore at the EKD. That was yesterday. Yesterday noon, I left there, and I went to, well, basically to a highway gas station with a big event hall, which is where my Bavarian Synod has its first meeting, where we just, the Synod members just elected the president. And I, as the bishop, gave a worship service yesterday, preached, and what do you call verpflichten? You know, ich habe die Synodalen verpflichtet. I asked them the question whether they would be ready to serve the church, and they had said amen, and I blessed them, and now they are Synod members. This is a very important meeting, and of course I told them I have this long-term engagement, so I just escaped from the Synod hall right now to be with you. But why am I telling this? Because even though the reason why we are here in a big event hall at a highway with lots of gas stations around us, instead of in one of our hotels where we normally are, the reason is the pandemic, because we had to postpone the first meeting of the newly elected Synod that was planned in March. So now we had to wait and wait and wait. And so we looked for an affordable place and for a place which is big enough. That was the reason. These were all external reasons why we came to this trucker hall. That is what it is. It's a trucker hall where we now have our Synod. And I thought it was a wonderful thing how God led us to this trucker hall, away from our hotels where we normally are. And now we are in a place where these truck drivers go in and out. And I had breakfast this morning with 3 of them, and they told me about their lives. They told me about how the pandemic had closed the gas stations or the restaurants where they always went to the bathroom when they stopped, and how they did not have their community anymore, how they became more and more lonely, all these things. And what I said in my sermon yesterday is, this is where we as a church have to go to the people rather than waiting to come to our sometimes very middle-class, educated kind of milieu churches. And so this is an example for me. I'm enthusiastic about this meeting place. I really have to say this, because it in a way, even though we did not intend it, it came from outside, but in a way it represents exactly where we as a church have to go to. We have to go out of our walls, out of the places where we normally feel great with each other. And we have to go to where the sorrow and also the laughter of the people is, where the people live and work. This is what we are right now. So sometimes God needs to push us to do what we theoretically might think about, but don't do. And so when we speak about public theology, public churches, this is one example how we leave our comfortable places. And what we just heard about the boat, the United for Rescue boat, that is another example where we said as a church, it must stop. That at the borders of this big continent of Europe with 500 million people, one of the wealthiest continents of this world, we are not ready to save people who are drowning and bring them to safe places in our continent, because we think, or some people think, then too many people will come to Europe. So let's push them back to Libya. And we as a church said, we cannot simply only look at this and maybe say something. We have to act, and we have to act in a way that is at the same time a political sign, that is a wake-up sign for those who are trying to build a fortress Europe against all those people who are desperate and even put themselves into this life endangering situation. That is another example how we as a church have very new experiences to work together with an NGO, Sea-Watch. We have never done that. And I think it's something we should include in our ways to go in the future, into the future as a church. So let me ask you, of course, Germany is a very different situation in many ways, but I experience the United States as a very polarized society right now. What is the role of the churches as you see it? And maybe first I can ask Traci, and then I would ask you, John, to also address this question. What do you think is the way of the church? I hear that you are very, very clear in justice questions, in racism questions. And I think that is exactly the way to go. At the same time, I see that there are a lot of people around whom you have to win. And sometimes, and that's a conflict that I'm in all the time. Sometimes it's so hard to be clear on one hand, and to please also people who ask me to be clear, but at the same time, wanting to win all those people who are not bad people, who simply maybe have influences on their lives, or maybe sometimes even good arguments against me that I also want to hear. So maybe, do you understand what I want to say, or what I address, Traci? If you could say a few words about that.
I believe I understand you, Heinrich, and thank you for the question. And more importantly, thank you for sharing some of how you arrived in this place today. It's relevant to my response to your question, because I remain convinced that ultimately we are changed by story. The Bible is a collection of stories, as sacred as it is. It is not God's book about a holy people. It is a people's book about a holy God. It is the story of their relationship with God, the ins and the outs of that relationship, and their interpretation of that relationship. And when I see the Bible that way, then the Bible has room for my story. If I look at it another way, then I have difficulty finding myself there. I have difficulty finding myself there as a Black American. I have difficulty finding myself there as a woman. But when I recognize that the purpose, the sanctity of the Bible, at least for me, is in the telling of story, and the sacredness of story, and the relationship that story represents for us to one another and to the God that we serve, then it expands my view of other things. I connect that to what you just said about your new gathering place. COVID has impacted us negatively in many ways, but there have also been some gifts of COVID. I would suggest that those gifts come at a price that was much too high to pay. May the memories of all those who've been lost be a blessing to us all. And I'm not suggesting that in any way that it was worth that. But I am saying that we have been forced to interact and to live differently than we were in America 6 months ago. So the church no longer has the option of walls, which takes us, some would say, into a new frontier, but I would suggest takes us back to those stories. For we know that for us, the birth of the church happened at Pentecost. And at Pentecost, we often focus on the infilling of the Spirit and the fire and the wind of that moment of the Spirit. But for me, the gift of Pentecost was not in the room, but outside in the streets. Once the Spirit fell, the Bible says that they left the room and went into the streets, and they began to speak to others in languages that those people could understand. It is no different than what we have now. People speak different languages, literally and metaphorically. People have different experiences that are translated for them differently. And every change that I've been able to make internally has been because of my connection to someone else's story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That has changed my outlook on prejudices and discriminations that I had to internalize, that I continue to work on. Listening to other people's stories changes us. And when we hear those stories, having ingested them, not for the purpose of dissecting them, but for the purpose of connection, then when something happens that would affect our brother or our sister or our sibling, is what I should say, that would affect them, we see the faces and we remember the stories.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
The gift of you being in a place where truckers are coming in and out is that you get to sit and have a meal or have a drink with them and hear their stories.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the foundational theological disconnect in humankind has not changed. It is the othering of people. It is the ability to distance ourselves by not fully seeing the humanity of people. It's the ability to look at people in boats that will not make it if you don't rescue them from the water, and somehow see less of God and less of humanity in them than we see in ourselves. This is the situation, right? And so this telling of story, this understanding of one another, this having to go outside of the box, and quite frankly, having the opportunity to have a bigger world because we're worshiping online, we're working online, we're communicating online, we are starving, at least I am starving, for human touch and human engagement. And so we're spending more time in a world that has now become smaller because we are all doing it in like fashion. That's where I start. I start with story, because if I can see you, even if I don't agree with you, then my heart starts to break open. In the US, we need lots of stories. We need to be able to sit down across differences and not ask, how could you possibly believe that? But perhaps ask, what is it in your story that leads you to where you are? Let me tell you what it is in my story that brings me to where I am.
Yes, I think it's so true what you say. And when you were speaking, I thought of my own change through stories. And before I asked John, just let me share my own position on homosexuality. That is exactly what happened. As a student, I told you, a student in Berkeley and Oakland in 1984, 85, for the first time, I lived on the campus with and fellow students with people who were gay and lesbian. I got to know them, and it didn't take long that I would think, how could you ever discriminate my friends in a certain way? And then when I taught at Union Theological Seminary as a Dietrich Bonhoeffer exchange professor in 1995, our best friends was an African-American woman and a white woman who were a couple, simply wonderful people. And when I spoke in Germany about why homosexual love deserves blessing just as any other love, I told the story of my friends at Union Theological Seminary. And my experience is exactly what you said. When you tell the story of real people, then it reaches the heart rather than having some abstract theological thesis or something. So thank you for sharing that so clearly. And John, I was really thinking when I heard you speak at our synod, I was wondering what is happening when you go back and when you speak the same way? I just heard, and I actually also read about it, that you do, about what you said when Trump was doing what he did. Can you tell me a little bit about what are the reactions? Do you lose people in your parish, or do people say, finally, there's a clear word, let's all go to listen to John Dorhauer the next time? What is the reaction, and how do you deal with it? You need to start your microphone.
The reaction varies because the United Church of Christ, one of our core values is no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you're welcome here. And so across the life of the United Church of Christ, we have people with very conservative theologies and people with very progressive theologies. And even though we have very open positions on homosexuality and the right of ordination for gay lesbians, the right of full marriage for gay lesbians, that doesn't mean that the United Church of Christ is populated with people who believe that to be the true articulation of the gospel. So when I speak that way, I will hear both from folk who are appreciative of that clarity and others who are disturbed and maybe even violated by that because it doesn't represent their point of view. In addition to hearing each other's story, what I would add is that what we highly value is the maintenance of relationship in the presence of these theological and political differences. And as clear as I am about the call to the gospel to speak truth and to represent justice, I am as clear about the call of the gospel to love your neighbor. And one cannot ask justice to displace the call of love, but neither can one use the power of love in a relationship to silence the voice of justice that must be spoken. And as hard as I work at speaking with clarity, the voice of the prophet and representing justice, I have to work as hard as a minister of the gospel and an agent of the transformative love of God. I have to work as hard to maintain love and dignity and respect in the relationships that I have, including with those who think very differently. I spent some time this morning responding to an email from a retired UCC pastor who wanted to know why the United Church of Christ still represented an organization like Black Lives Matter. He says, when violence is erupting across the United States, even in protest to injustice, it's wrong. And you should not represent any organization that perpetrates violence. I'm also spending tomorrow evening, after visiting with my grandchildren in Chicago, 5.5 hours away, I'm spending tomorrow evening visiting with members of a church in California who want to address the same question to me. How can you support Black Lives Matter? And both in order to maintain the relationship with these people who see the world very differently, but also to represent with clarity what I believe the truth of the gospel to be, I maintain open dialogue with all audiences across the life of the denomination. And it isn't as simple as we're a just peace church, the president speaks words of justice and peace, and then everybody appreciates it. It's nothing like that at all. And as important as it is to ensure that every story is represented and every voice heard, it's as important once their story is told for them to realize that there's nothing about that story that disqualifies them from being in relationship with us.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me. I like the description by Michael Walzer, the American philosopher, on what prophecy is. He said that a prophet is a connected critic. And I think that's very true. Prophecy is not being on a moral high ground and putting yourself high up there and kind of devaluating other people that you speak to. But prophecy is, and if you look at the biblical prophets, they were connected with the powerful people they spoke to. The prophet Nathan, when he speaks to David, it comes out of a relationship. And then he speaks the truth. You are the man. That's why I think, yeah?
As important, Heinrich, is not only the connection to the power so that the power will hear, because if you speak and nobody hears, what's the point? But also a connection to those who suffer unjustly. That has to be an authentic relationship and connection.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you lose the authority to speak.
Well, that's the biblical option for the poor as the foundation of its understanding of justice. Traci, can I ask you, picking up on the story approach, what is your experience with people who tell you their stories, if it's even possible, who represent values that are in deep contradiction to Christian values? Is there any sharing of stories beyond a certain common ground? People, I am confronted with letters or accusations in terms of the refugee question, for example, right-wing populists or whatever, and my dialogue experience is very different. With some people, it seems like it doesn't even make any sense because there's no atmosphere of listening to each other. But with others, I see how things move. Can I ask you simply what your experience is with people that are very far away from your value ground? A microphone, please. Can you start the microphone? Thanks.
I apologize. I cut it off so I wouldn't.
Yeah, sure.
Sure. I'll give a basic premise and then I'll give you an example. I believe that listening is a skill. And so often people think because they're not speaking that they're listening. And that's not always the case. So I work really hard to train myself to listen without anticipating my response, without preparing my response, but to give 100% of my attention to that, if it's that kind of conversation. I often have conversations with people who have different points of view than I. And most of the time, quite frankly, it is with people of my same faith rather than people of differing faiths. That's just my own experience of it. I believe that all of our faiths have some unifying factors. I don't know of any faith that does not have some type of command to serve your neighbor, to honor your neighbor, to serve the poor. Those kinds of things we share across faiths, in my opinion. And even for people who claim no faith, most of the time there's some moral compass that requires those same kinds of actions. When you ask me that question, I often think back. Last year, I took a trip to Israel and Palestine, and I took it with 5 other women whom I absolutely adore and I have deep relationship with. 3 of them are rabbis, and the other 2 were Christian ministers as well. And we decided to go to Israel and Palestine because we've been studying scripture together. We study Torah, and then we study Christian texts as well. And we have deep disagreements about what's happening in Israel. We see it from completely different points of view, even though we're listening to one another. So we decided that we would go together and attempt to see what the other person saw, just for the purpose of conversation. During an evening of that trip, on Shabbat, we celebrated Shabbat with a Jewish family there, a rabbi and their family. And during the course of that conversation, there was a young teenage boy there. There were two male children. One was in the army of this Jewish family and was home on a break from the army, had just gotten in the night before. And the other was a high school young man. And he was all excited about this notion of Black Lives Matter. What he knew of Black Lives Matter, he wanted to be supportive of that. He was eager to have conversation with me about that. And we were off to a great start. And then the conversation of Palestine came up. And he wanted to know why we were going to spend time in Palestine and not just in Israel. And I began to express to him that I saw deep connections between Palestinian oppression and the oppression of Black people in the United States. And I elaborated on that greatly. And I saw his face turn because I was paying attention to him. And he said to me, how can I stand with you if you wish that I were dead? Which is not what I'd said, but that's what he had heard. We sat in that place of pain together with everyone else listening, but no one speaking for about a half hour as I listened to his story and then shared some of my story. It is not a place where we came out agreeing, but I feel very deeply that we came out seeing one another.
Yeah.
And I was changed by his story. And I hope that he was changed by mine. My position was not changed, but my understanding of his fear, of his interpretation of the moment still causes me to pray for him today. I'm not suggesting that story always brings unity. I am suggesting that story always adds humanity. And the fact that I was able to listen to him and that he was able to listen to me, I think changed both of us.
Well, that's very moving. Just hearing you say it, hear you tell about it. I can imagine so well in my heart what happened between you, and how this man probably for the first time did not feel judged, but felt empathy. And what you were describing is basically empathy. And what comes to my mind is Jesus' golden rule. Do unto others what you want them to do unto you. This is the law and the prophets in Matthew 7:12. That is a very strong sentence that Jesus makes. And what fascinates me is that this one sentence at the end, this is the law and the prophets, is only to be found at one other place in the New Testament. And that's the double commandment of love, or the triple commandment of love. This is the law and the prophets. So empathy, just putting yourself in the position of the other, that is so central. And it's a central aspect of love.
I believe the reason, or at least my interpretation of why Jesus hangs everything on that, because if we could act from that place, I believe that we would have less war, and we would have less raging hatred. We would have less violence, because we would understand that we have to make, as one of my mentors, Reverend James Forbes, says, we have to make space for grace, right? And a part of that story was, I believe, that for the first time, that young man heard me say, as a very strong advocate for Palestinian justice, that my desire to see justice in Palestine does not equate to my desire to see oppression in Israel, right? And that those are not necessary partners for me. And that I desire and want peace and love and prosperity in Israel as much as I want it for Palestinians. That my desire for Black liberation does not equate to a desire to turn the tables and now have white people be oppressed. These are the fears that drive so much of the vitriol that we're living with.
Yeah.
And if we don't have conversations where we really hear one another and hear the stories that are attached to that. Some of those stories, by the way, are stories that have been fed to us and not stories that we should own.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you very much for sharing these thoughts. I would like to ask you, John, another question, and a question that I have to do with all the time, and we probably all have to do with all the time, and that is the relationship between simply speaking prophetically against something we see that is unjust, for example, and at the same time, the question whether we should give advice to politicians, say things that politicians can really use for their practical daily decisions. In my 6 criteria of public theology that I developed in a volume that I called Liberation Theology for a Democratic Society, Essays in Public Theology, 2 of the criteria are prophetic witness and then political advice. I even gave that the dignity of an own criteria, because my logic in this book is to say we have seen transformation societies like Brazil or South Africa where liberation theology has developed, in Brazil, for example. And then all of a sudden, those who had participated in developing this prophetic liberation theology were in power. After Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki in South Africa, they were in the government now. And in Brazil, Lula da Silva was in the government. So it's not enough anymore to speak about the exodus of the unjust place. You also need to speak about what you do when you arrive at a different place. So that's why theology needs to, that's for me the step from liberation theology to public theology, which is basically, in my view, the same, but it's at a different stage in a certain way. And when you are either in power or have the position to influence power, as we have it in Germany, we have access to the governing people, and we have good dialogues, also critical dialogues. And why I developed that criteria was because I did not just want to say what they do wrong, but I want to help them to put ethical guidelines into their daily political questions. And sometimes they are dilemma questions. It's not easy, certain things. And I do understand that certain things have different faces that might look very clear morally at the first sight. So I want to be in dialogue with those who really have to do politics. And I want to support those people in power, in politics, who lead us the right way into a transformation of society. And I would just be interested in also then hear it from you, Traci, as well, how you react to this.
So a few things in response. When I was the conference minister in the Southwest Conference here, and my office was in Phoenix, Arizona, I had the privilege of hosting a weekly radio show. Mm-hmm. And the title of the show was Relevance, and the tagline was Where Faith and Politics Collide. Mm-hmm. And every week on the show, I would have somebody either from the faith community or from the political community, and I would talk about how their faith informed their political choices, mm-hmm. and how the moral compass that faith gives somebody over a lifetime affects the political choices they make. And it was an argument. It's often said in the United States that faith and politics don't mix. That's why my tagline was where faith and politics collide, because they're not inseparable. And that is also why Traci oversees a team of national officers from the United Church of Christ who work in Washington, D.C. for the sole purpose of representing our voice, not just as the prophetic voice saying, don't do this, but as the urgent voice saying, do this. These are pieces of legislation that we support around climate change, around immigration and refugee justice, around LGBT rights, around Black Lives Matter concerns. And so we maintain an office in the seat of power, and we employ members of our national staff to walk those halls and speak truth to power. And there is a long history of officers, of general ministers and presidents and associate general ministers like Traci Blackmon, who have spoken in the halls of Congress. I remember the week before Barack Obama left office in January of 2017, sitting down with a team of staff members from Barack's office, President Obama's office, to talk about urging the president to take one final executive action to shore up justice for immigrants and refugees. And I was there with, it was an interfaith coalition of religious leaders. And I remember, and by the way, Traci Blackmon was on Barack Obama's faith advisory team. I remember leaving and saying, it will be at least 4 years before we're invited back in here. But that didn't mean it would be another 4 years before the president would hear from us. I want to add one more thing, and then I'll invite Traci's thoughts here. Part of what we're seeing, both in terms of the polarization in the US between the religious and political left and the religious and political right, and also the rise of what I'll call fascism, is a byproduct of the religious right 40 years ago organizing its collective power and wealth to influence directly the halls of Congress in the US. And the religious left has not seen fit to organize its resources in nearly equal capacity. I used to travel the country with a Presbyterian minister who was also a clinical psychologist. And we had both done research on the tactics of the religious right. And this is an American reference that may not translate easily into the German context. But when we talk about football in the US, we're not talking about European soccer. We're talking about that very brutal, rough and tough, almost violent sport that we play here in America. And there's a version called tackle football, where in order to end the play, you tackle the person with the ball and wrestle them to the ground. There's also a softer version called touch football, where all you have to do is lay your hand on the person with the ball and the play ends. It's a very soft version of the game. And Andrew Weaver, this Presbyterian minister, and I used to travel the country talking about the religious right. And he would say, they're playing tackle football and you're playing touch football, and you're going to lose this game every time. And he was right. Now, this doesn't mean I'm calling progressive Christians to take on a more violent approach, but it does mean we cannot be passive when it comes to the political options that represent the core values that the gospel calls us to speak to. And too often we find ourselves passive and absent and silent. And there's nothing about our faith that should condition us to behave that way in the political arena.
Before Traci speaks, I was asked to give a little break so the translators can change.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is what I wanted to say.
All right, okay. So you just give us a sign when you're ready to let us continue to speak.
If I can just be completely transparent, I'm going to be anyway. So,
yeah, right.
I know many people don't share my opinion of this, but for me, I feel that one must choose the palace or choose prophecy. I have difficulty seeing the prophet in politics. I just feel that the way it's structured, what one is called to do, that once you step into those roles, that you become a part of the establishment.
That's the danger.
I felt that way even about Nelson Mandela. So I just want to say that, because that's how I feel. I feel that inherent in empire is a need to maintain status quo, is a need to maintain inequitable distribution of wealth, is a need to maintain hierarchy. And inherent in the call of my ministry is the need for equitable distribution of resources, for communal life to be not hierarchically orchestrated, for the well-being of the common person with no less value to the ordinary people. I'm preaching tomorrow about ordinary people. You know, the prophets in the Bible were ordinary people. And we don't know all the prophets who were around in that time. It was whoever would say yes and be open to the flow of the Spirit. And I feel that that role puts one in opposition to the empire always. And so I'm not able to reconcile the two. I'm willing to listen, and I'm not saying because I think this is it, but it is where I am. I have not seen yet. I've seen leaders who are better than other leaders, certainly. I've seen leaders with more compassion than other leaders, but the nature of the empire is the preservation of empire.
Now, can I ask you more? I think the danger that you're describing is very present in my mind. And I try to think of it as often as I can. Where do I do what you say happens? But at the same time, I see people in politics who are deeply committed to ideals, to faith, purposes, all these things. And my feeling is I do not want to leave them alone, because what they do is needed for transformation. What happens if I say my thing, if I preach, but there are no people who try to bring these things into the daily political life?
So I believe that everyone has a role. And I believe politicians have roles, but that is not the role of the prophetic voice. That's just how I feel about it.
Sure.
I feel that, you know, in instances in the Bible, you mentioned David earlier. If my memory holds correctly, David had 3 prophets in his life. There was Samuel, who went to his father Jesse and anointed him king by direction of God. There was Nathan, who corrected him in his sin with Bathsheba. And there was Gath, who came to him and spoke to him in the cave in Adullam. Those are the three that I remember. In all of those instances, there was relationship with David, but the prophet was outside of the system. That's what I'm not saying that I don't have relationship with politicians. I'm not saying that we shouldn't use our presence in every way we can. And certainly we try. I mean, I know that I try, I know John tries. We use our relationship and our presence and our sense of urgency to move things. If we didn't believe that it was possible to work, we wouldn't try to do that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that I don't believe that one can be that prophetic voice and be the politician. I think that tension is necessary.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Between the prophetic ministry and between the empire, the tension is necessary. And even when we support things, if people do things that are good, I think we should support that and we should celebrate that and we should work with them. But we should always have within us the authority and the compelling nature to call out evil, even if we must call it out against someone for whom we stood with something else. That is the call. And when you are in the empire, you're not always able to live into that call. I'm willing to be challenged on that. I'm just being honest about where I am.
No, that's very good. That's very good. And it's very helpful because I'm absolutely clear that what you're describing is a clear danger in a position that I, for example, I am in. I think what I'm not so clear with is the notion of empire. I mean, it has a long history and I know the documents on empire and everything. But for me, it's too fixed, as if there was this system. I see a lot of varieties of different ways of trying to transform government and politics into an ecologically and fair and just situation. And I cannot see there's this one world of empire and then there's one world of justice, but I see a lot of things in between. And that's why it's hard for me to really conceptualize the notion. If there was this almost evil place, then I could only say, not me. But I see much more continuity between different ways of, for example, a market economy. If it's a social market economy with a clear social framework, as we has it at least as an ideal in Germany, completely different from a Manchester liberal capitalism that is absolutely rightly condemned by the ecumenical document. So it's complete, for me, it's a very different thing. But which do we mean when we speak about the system? But this is just, I just share my questions. It's a different situation, yeah.
And I can hear that and respect that. I can only speak from my context.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, same here.
My context is not that.
Yeah, okay.
It's a very capitalistic, self-preserving context. And in my 57 years of life, I have not seen it be anything else.
Okay.
Right? So I long for a government that would, for instance, offer health care to everyone.
Yes.
I long for government that would offer education to everyone.
Yes.
But we all speak from our context.
Yes.
That's the richness of story, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
This is my context. I do not, in my context, see the possibility of the prophet dwelling in.
I understand that very well. John, the both of us talked so long, you couldn't say something. Can you comment that too, or add something?
Just a couple of things. One is, I understand what Traci says when she talks about the prophet cannot be wedded to empire. But I also think the empire needs its John Lewis's, folk who would never call themselves prophets, but who are in the halls of empire to cause what he called good trouble. And then the other thing I would say, Heinrich, is you talk about that in between, that it isn't just empire and injustice, that there are these in between stages. As we begin to look at what white privilege is and does, Traci and I live in the same country, and we are citizens of the same government. And that economy that she talks about, that capitalist economy, is a Black woman, 57 years of age. Her experience within that economy is very different than mine. So we hold the same gospel values. We preach similar gospels. We relate in some ways in the same way to the empire that we are called as prophets to critique. But I experience that empire and its distribution of wealth and power very differently than she does. So it can be easy for me as a white man in this culture to have a more ambivalent relationship with empire than a 57-year-old Black woman in this same context. And when Traci says she can only speak from her context, that's a part of the context that affords her a voice that I can't imitate, right? And an experience that I can't replicate.
No, I understand that.
I also want to add, if you'll allow me, from the chat, there's a question from Crystal. And I think it's important to speak to this in this moment, Heinrich, mainly because of what you said about being so bifurcated to say empire over here and prophetic over here. The question she asked is not the church a kind of empire?
I see it now in the chat.
It absolutely is. And I'm saying that the prophet is also called to speak to the empire of the church. So in that original framing, I was talking about political empire, but the church is also institutionalized political empire. The church, for my experience and my knowledge of the United States, created some of the founding documents that we live into to justify and fortify racial oppression. So the institutionalization is what I'm speaking to. And biblically, when I study prophets in the Bible, and I think there are many more of them in the Bible than there really are among us today, but when I study the prophets in the Bible, most of the time they are speaking to those who have already identified with the same belief, right? They're not speaking their harsh critiques, and the critique is for the believers. It is not for those who don't believe.
Absolutely.
It's for the believers. So the prophet is called to speak truth to institutional power. I'm saying empire, whether that is political, whether that is theological, wherever it is found. And it is often found in the church.
Absolutely. John.
I was going to say, I'm going to go all the way back to your time in Berkeley, that Black Lutheran church just down the street, where you found an articulation of the faith that would help shape you on your journey. And I'm going to tie that into what Traci just said and what Crystal is asking about the church's empire. Howard Thurman was a Black theologian in the mid-20th century in the US, founded the Church for All Peoples in San Francisco, just across the bay from Berkeley and Oakland. And in one of his books, he wrote this line, and this was a book about the songs of the slaves, that spiritual music that is still alive in the Black church today. He wrote this: by some amazing but vastly creative spiritual insight, the slave undertook the redemption of a religion the master had profaned. And I would argue that part of what you were experiencing in that Black Lutheran church just down the street from where you live was the continual work of the Black voice in the white church in America, redeeming and a religion attached to empire that the master had profaned. And And it is, in fact, the case, at least in America today, where the white church has an empirical presence.
Mm-hmm.
When we begin to talk about liberation theology, whether it's the Latin American liberation theology of a Gustavo Gutierrez or the Black American liberation theology of a James Cone, it's not just that God's preferential option is for the poor. It is that the only way that the empirical church can be redeemed is through the voice of the poor.
Mm-hmm. Well, it would be, I mean, I absolutely hear that and understand that. And I think you described, it speaks to my heart what you just said about the experience of St. Philip's Lutheran Church in Oakland. I think that's exactly what happened. That's what I felt intuitively. That's why it's so precious to me. And of course, it is a challenge. And now I'm a church leader. And what does that do to me? At the same time, I have a deep love for the church, and I want the church, also the institutional church, I want it to change. I wanted to live up to what it is. I preached last night. I preached about salt of the earth and light of the world, and Jesus says, "You are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. Not you should be. You are." And what does that mean for us? And who is the church? I think that would be, I mean, I have a meeting in 10 minutes at 9, so I really have to leave them. But if we had another hour, that would be really wonderful to speak about what the church is. Who is the church? My image of the church, the first thing is we are all the church. It's not the ministers. It's not the presidents of whatever else. We are all the church, but you're speaking, of course, now about the church as an institution. So what is the relationship between the church as an institution to the church as we believe it? Paul speaks about Christ being the body of, we are the body of Christ. That's the church. That is the church we believe. But what is the relationship between that church that we believe and this church that prints out salary bills and all these things, you know? That's our church as well. And I want the empirical church with its salary bills, I want it always to be transformed by the church as we believe it. That is my calling. And how do I do it? That's what I would get some ideas about.
So you have 10 minutes. May I have 2 of them?
Yeah, actually, more than that.
I want to say, just circling back to some of the examples we used earlier. I mean, clearly David was empire. David became the king. David was empire. But what made David's reign different is that David's heart remained open to God. And there were the prophetic who challenged David. There was always that tension. It wasn't always right, because we are human and none of us are always right. I am merely suggesting that in order for beloved community to be realized, that tension must always be there. And that the prophet cannot, there must always be prophetic voice that stands outside of empire, so that we can be called back to ourselves. We see that over and over and over again in the story of David. Just for one example, certainly David was used by God. And the scripture says he was a man after God's own heart. But as king, Nathan had to pay him a visit, right? So I think we all have our roles, and those roles change in different ways. And I don't mean to disparage anyone's role, but from my context, for me, I am called to stand outside of that, even though I too am a part of an institution. I have to call that institution out as well.
And I'll just add real quickly, as freely as I talk about the church as representing empirical characteristics, I'm a part of the institution. I'm the general minister and president of a denomination in the United States, right? So I'm a part of this empire that I'm critiquing. I'm aware that as a white man in America, I have power and privilege that's afforded to me simply because of that. And for me, the question then becomes, how do I use that? How do I broker and leverage that power for the common good? And as Traci says, we all have roles. It's my responsibility to discern what the Holy Spirit has called me to do with the power that I'm given. And there are those who are called to agitate from the outside for change, and there are those who are called to remain a part of it internally to make that change. And I feel as long as I am authentic and true to that call, then I'm comfortable with the position that I hold.
Well, thank you very much. Traci,
right.
I think the 2 minutes are not long enough. I think you should speak more. Well,
I don't want you to miss your meeting.
Yeah, well, they can wait. No. They're right across, but it's the church, the council of the Bavarian Church that we meet in between, and so and we interrupted and everything. But this was so precious to me. I must really say that, and I wish we had much more time. I know that you have already had a long seminar, and Crystal can maybe tell us, is that something like her talk, Traci's talk? Can I see that? Will it be in the internet somehow?
Yes.
Okay, so I can have some more Traci and some more John maybe also, and look at it and listen to it. So please send me the link, Crystal, when you have it, so I can maybe follow that a little bit.
And Heinrich, please know that John and I do this very often. You're welcome to join us anytime.
All right. Well, it's really easy.
We don't have to have an audience for it. We can just have a
Right.
conversation.
Yes. Oh, that sounds great, actually, because I must say, you can say what you want about Zoom conference and all these things, but it is amazing how closely it comes in my memories to real physical encounters. When after the lockdown period, I went back to the headquarters in Hanover, and I ran into people, and I thought I had seen them last week. It was all Zoom, you know. It's really great. So let's continue somehow. It was a great honor and privilege to just listen to you. I know I also talked a lot, but I take a lot with me, I can tell you. I will tell my colleagues, my other bishops here, about this talk I just had, and about how beautiful this connection to the United States and our church as brothers and sisters in Christ all over the world is, whether we are in the south or in the east or the west or in the north. So thank you very much, and God bless you all.
Bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Herzlichen Dank.
Gerne.
John und Heinrich Bedford-Strohm und Traci Blackmon. Wir haben einen wunderbaren Abend hier mit Ihnen und euch gehabt. Und wir haben mit den Stories begonnen. Dem Story aus der Trucker Hall. Und wir haben im Grunde mit den Stories auch wieder geendet. Und ich fühle mich erinnert an die biblische Geschichte, die Stories, die uns immer wieder helfen zu verstehen, wo wir stehen sollen und wo unsere Aufgabe ist. Und ja, am Ende führt mich das immer wieder da zurück, dieses Buch der wundervollen Geschichten des heiligen Gottes zu lesen und mich da einzufinden und mich da einzubetten. Vielen herzlichen Dank. Wir gehen gleich zur Andacht rüber. Die wird jetzt wahrscheinlich ein bisschen später anfangen, als wir gedacht haben, weil wir zumindest jetzt noch 2 Etagen runter müssen. Okay. Und und gucken müssen, dass wir uns da einfinden und gerade ein bisschen sortieren. Ich lade alle herzlich ein, an dieser Andacht teilzunehmen und den Abend und damit auch das Forum Church Goes Public, Church Remains Public zu beenden. Danke ganz herzlich für diesen Höhepunkt heute Abend. Es hat mich sehr gefreut, es ist mir sehr ans Herz gegangen. Ihnen und euch dreien zuzuhören.
Danke, thank you and bye bye.
Bye.